Hi, my name is John Glover and I'm the Behavioral Health Project Specialist at Metastar. Today we'll be talking about using the US audit to screen for at-risk alcohol use in primary care practices. Our objectives for today are for you to be able to identify the level of alcohol use that responds best to brief interventions in primary care, describe the benefits of using the US Audit 1 through 3 and US Audit to screen for at-risk alcohol use, and determine the right level of intervention for your patients based on the results of their alcohol screening. Most of the information used for today's presentation came from the CDC's guide entitled Planning and Implementing Screening and Brief Interventions for Risky Alcohol Use, a step-by-step guide for primary care practices. This is a very concise and yet complete guide that can be a great help in getting started with alcohol screening. There are only 18 pages of text, and the rest is about 28 pages of appendices. Let's start off by looking at the levels of alcohol use. We often worry that we might be overwhelmed by the number of positive scores from alcohol screens, but statistics show that only about 4% of patients will fall into the risky dependent use category and require a referral for additional specialty treatment. Most people, about 71%, actually drink at moderate levels and can be encouraged to continue this pattern of use. It's the remaining 25% who are the ones we want to focus on in primary care. These are the risky, non-dependent drinkers who tend to benefit the most from brief interventions in the primary care setting. So let's look at the screening tools. Here are some of the more familiar screening tools that we have used for a long time. First is the CAGE questionnaire, which primarily focused on more dependent alcohol use by assessing whether the patient had ever felt C, that they had needed to cut down on their alcohol use, A, that they have been annoyed by another's comments about their alcohol use, G, guilty about their alcohol use, or E, like they needed an eye-opener in the morning. The popularity of this screen may be one of the reasons we have become used to referring patients for specialty care, since that is what it was designed to assess. Next are the Audit C and Audit, which have also been around for a long time. The Audit C was derived from the audit to act as a brief screen which could provide information regarding a patient's frequency of use, amount of use, and binge use. These criteria were then used to determine whether the patient's drinking could be causing them harm. The Audit Full Screen uses DSM criteria and the consequences of a patient's alcohol use to assess the harm they may be experiencing. So now let's look at what the CDC recommends in their guide. The CDC recognized the time limitations in primary care and included the single question alcohol screen, which is, how many times in the past year have you had X or more drinks in a day? X is 5 for men and 4 for women or any adult over 65 years of age. This screen focuses on binge-style alcohol use, which can be either risky non-dependent or risky dependent in nature. The screen is more useful in primary care settings because the risky non-dependent type of alcohol use is the type we are trying to address in a primary care setting. Additionally, the CDC recommends a couple of updated versions of the Audit and Audit C called the US Audit and the US Audit 1 through 3. The US Audit 1 through 3 is like the Audit C and that it is a brief screen that uses the first 3 questions of the full audit screen as a pre-screening tool to determine whether the patient's drinking could be causing harm. The US Audit full screen is like the audit in that it uses DSM criteria and the consequences of a patient's alcohol use to assess the harm they may be experiencing. So let's look at what led to the recommendation to update the previous version of the audit to the US Audit version. First, let's look at the weaknesses of the Audit C. In addition to its limited response options, 5 instead of the US Audit 1 through 3's 7, it's important to understand that the audit and the Audit C were developed for the World Health Organization. And so the Audit C uses international units of alcohol, 10 grams, instead of the units of alcohol recognized here in the United States, which is 14 grams. Therefore, it does not correlate well with the NIAAA guidelines for alcohol consumption here in our country. It also fails to reflect age-related differences and required an adjustment to the scoring to reflect gender differences. But most importantly, research has shown that it can produce up to 20% false positive responses. This means that 1 out of every 5 patients screened will be told that they may have an alcohol problem when they actually don't, and be asked to complete additional screening. The frustration that the patient may have with this, along with the extra time required to manage it, is unnecessary and unwanted in a busy primary care office. Not to mention the difficulty a clinician would have in explaining the positive score, since it would not correlate with the NIAAA guidelines. Now let's look at the advantages the US Audit 1 through 3 provides. First, the US Audit 1 through 3 version of the audit tool was designed by the same researchers who initially developed the original audit for the World Health Organization. They knew then that it was not applicable to other nations whose standard alcohol unit was different from the 10 grams that the WHO decided to use, and recommended that the tool be adjusted when used in other countries. This was not done here in the United States until the development of the US Audit. Second, the US Audit 1 through 3 has been adjusted to reflect the US standard alcohol unit of 14 grams. It has also been adjusted to correlate directly with the NIAAA guidelines for alcohol consumption here in the United States. And its questions have been adjusted to reflect both gender and age differences. But most importantly, these changes have eliminated the issue of false positives, allowing for productive conversations with patients regarding the results of their screen and how it relates to recommendations for low-risk alcohol consumption. So let's look at how to use the US Audit tool. First, we'll take a quick look at the NIAAA guidelines for low-risk alcohol consumption. For men, the recommendation is no more than 4 drinks on any one day, and no more than 14 drinks in a week. For women, the recommendation is no more than 3 drinks on any one day, and no more than 7 drinks in a week. Keep in mind that the recommendations for women also apply to adults over the age of 65. So how does the US Audit 1 through 3 correlate with these guidelines? You'll notice that the US Audit 1 through 3 has 2 additional response options that provide more opportunity for clarifying the patient's alcohol consumption. The Audit C is scored on a 0 to 4 scale, and the US Audit is scored on a 0 to 6 scale. A score of 4 is considered positive on the Audit C, and for the US Audit 1 through 3, a score of 8 is considered positive for men under 65 years of age, while a score of 7 is considered positive for women and all adults over 65 years of age. So let's take a couple of examples to illustrate how well the U.S. Audit 1 through 3 correlates with the NIAAA guidelines. First, we'll use a male who goes home every night and has one drink, a beer, whatever, and doesn't really increase his use on the weekends. He will get a 6 on the first question and a 0 on the second and third questions for a total score of 6. This is below the 8 required for a positive and 7 drinks per week below the low-risk guidelines. So his score is negative and his drinking is within the low-risk recommendations. However, on the Audit C, having 7 drinks per week would have given him a score of 4 immediately on question number 1, and he would have been told that he was positive and required additional screening. This is a good example of a significant false positive. Next, let's use a female who goes home every night and has one drink, maybe a glass of wine in her case, and also doesn't increase her use on the weekends. She will get a score of 6 on the first question and 0 on the second and third questions for a total score of 6. This is below the 7 required for a positive and exactly in line with the 7 drinks per week she is allowed, so her score is negative and her drinking is also within the low-risk guidelines. However, on the Audit C, having 7 drinks a week would have given her a score of 4 immediately on question 1, and she also would have been told that she was positive and required additional screening. Another good example of a false positive. These first 3 questions will identify the 71% of low-risk drinkers versus the 29% of at-risk drinkers. The final 7 questions of the U.S. Audit are the same as the original audit because they reflect on the DSM criteria and harms the patient may have experienced from alcohol use. These questions will help identify the difference between the 25% of risky non-dependent drinkers and the 4% of risky dependent drinkers, allowing you to offer brief interventions and support to the risky non-dependent group and referral recommendations to the risky dependent group. Now let's look at the scoring for the U.S. Audit. Here are the scoring categories and the suggested interventions for each level. First, we have the lowest score range, 0 to 6/7. 6 for women and adults over 65 years of age, and 7 for men. This will be identified by the U.S. Audit 1 through 3 pre-screen. The recommended intervention for this group is to validate their appropriate use of alcohol, educate them regarding the low-risk guidelines, and encourage them to remain within these limits. Next, we see the first level of positive scores, 7/8 to 15. 7 for women and adults over 65 years of age, and 8 for men under 65 years of age, which suggests that the patient is drinking above the recommended guidelines. The recommendation here is for a brief intervention. This can be as simple as showing them their score and how it relates to the low-risk guidelines, and then discussing the potential negative impact this could have on their health with a recommendation to decrease their use so that it is within the low-risk guidelines. The next level of positive scores, 16 to 24, suggests that the patient is both drinking above the low-risk guidelines and possibly experiencing alcohol-related harm. The recommendation here is for both a brief intervention and follow-up to make sure the patient is able to be successful in achieving their goal to decrease alcohol use. The highest level of positive scores, 25 and above, suggests that the patient may have alcohol dependence symptoms. The recommendation in this case is to offer your support in referring them to specialized alcohol treatment. Before we leave this slide, I want you to quickly review it and notice how the various scoring categories progress from screening to rule out those who are drinking within low-risk guidelines, to brief interventions, and finally to referrals where specialty care services may be more helpful. Now let's take a minute to see how well those scoring categories and suggestions for intervention correlate with the SBIRT approaches that many of us are familiar with. If you're not familiar with SBIRT, it stands for Screening, Brief Intervention, and Referral to Treatment, which is a program that has been shown to be very effective in helping patients to address alcohol issues. First, we provide an initial brief screening using the US-AUDIT 1 through 3 to identify the 71% of patients who are drinking within low-risk recommendations and differentiate them from those with risky drinking behaviors. Then we use the full US-AUDIT screen to further identify which patients might benefit from a brief intervention alone, a brief intervention with additional follow-up, or a referral to specialty care. Depending on the score, a patient may fall into the 25% of risky non-dependent drinkers or the 4% of risky dependent drinkers. The 25% in the risky non-dependent group will be the most likely to benefit from a brief intervention or a brief intervention with follow-up. The 4% in the risky dependent group will benefit more from your support and a referral to specialty treatment. Personally, I really appreciate the way the US-AUDIT tools complement the SBIRT approach to addressing alcohol issues. Finally, I'd just like to leave you with this thought. You don't need to be an expert in treating substance use. Simply let your patient know that you're concerned about the impact alcohol may be having on their health and that you recommend they consider changing their behavior. These patients may not even realize the negative impact alcohol could be having on them, and they need our help. Thank you for your attention today. I hope the information we discussed will be helpful in your work with this group of patients.